On February 3, 1972, a family of 4 was brutally killed in the little town of Boone, leaving the neighborhood in shock and the case unresolved for decades. The family was ultimately able to find closure, and a dark period in the town's history was finally brought to light in 2022 because of the diligent efforts of the detectives. Today's inquiry takes us to the picturesque city of Boone, North Carolina, a quaint mountain hamlet hidden away in the state's northwest among the Blue Ridge Mountains. Visitors who enjoy the outdoors and outdoor enthusiasts frequently go here. Bryce Durham, the son of Coy M. Durham and Collie Devon Crab Durham, arrived in the magnificent state of North Carolina on November 12, 1926. He was a man of many talents and profound experiences. Bryce's siblings, Ralph L. Durham and Gail Durham Mandan, had a big impact on him. He graduated from Appalachian State University with a degree in history and physical education, and after the war, he worked for a year as a teacher at Mount Pleasant School in Wilkes County. However, his professional path changed, and he spent 6 years running the Mount Airy Auto Loan and Sales Finance Company before relocating to Boone, North Carolina. Even though he had a varied professional background, he had spent the previous 13 years working for a home finance company, where he had learned priceless business and financial skills. Bryce Durham was a committed resident of the Boone neighborhood up until his awful and untimely death in 1972. Virginia was the offspring of Virginia Lucina Eller Church and Calvin M. Church. Her birthday is October 24, 1927. She was one of 5 siblings. The other 4, Winnie Levant Church, Elliot Dosha Church, Dovey Pierce Church Baker, and Rena Mozu Baumgartner Walsh, had a big influence on her life as she grew up. Virginia gave birth to a girl in 1951, whom Bryce and Virginia named Ginny Sue Durham, the same year they got married. On May 2, 1953, they gave birth to a boy who they called Bobby Joe Durham. They were a loving, close-knit family. Later on, Ginny Sue wed Troy Hall, her true love. In the Stern Mountains near Boone, North Carolina, the Durham family had found bliss. The 3-person family decided to move to Boone in 1969 after previously residing in Wilkes and Mount Airy. Their home, as 187 Clyde Townsend Road, was located on a constrained driveway just off the 105 bypasses. Ginny Sue Hall and her husband were just 4 miles from the Durham's ideal setting, a refuge from life's worries. On the night of February 3, 1972, in the quiet hamlet of Boone, North Carolina, the weather was unfavorable. In the chilly wind that blew through the trees, snowflakes danced erratically. Inside their home on Clyde Townsend Road, the Durham family sought shelter from the bitter cold. Bryce Durham, the owner of a Buick dealership, had recently relocated with his wife, Virginia, a librarian, and their son, Bobby, had just begun his freshman year at Appalachian State University. The family was known for being diligent, private, and preferring alone. But as the wind howled outside, something wicked was growing inside, and a calamity was about to occur that would shake Boone to its very core. The Durham family had no idea how profoundly their lives would soon change. On the evening of February 3, 1972, Bryce and Virginia Durham were at home with their son Bobby when a horrible tragedy struck. The Hall family was content and at rest while they were sitting in their split-level residence, but their peace was soon disturbed. Before anyone could make sense of the conversation, it stopped abruptly, leaving Justin Troy Hall wondering if it was simply a cruel joke. They were shattered by a horrifying phone call that left them shaking. The seriousness of the situation was emphasized by Virginia Durham's scared voice on the other end of the line, quivering as she spoke in a hushed tone to her son-in-law about numerous trespassers who had broken into her house. Ginny was afraid for their family's safety despite Hall's doubts about the call's legitimacy. They hurried to the car, which obstinately refused to start as it was risky to drive up to the Durham's house. They couldn't move around on foot. Fortunately, a local private eye named Cecil Small offered to drive them there. Ginny remained outside while Hal and their neighbor, Cecil, went inside. They spotted a wild scene inside the house. However, the true horror of the situation only became apparent when they entered the ground floor restroom. The house had been looted, and the air was filled with the sound of flowing water. The house was silent since the phone line had been severed from the wall, and in the little room where they were found, Bryce, Bobby, and Virginia Durham's still-clothed bodies were found in the bathtub with their gloomy heads submerged and the water still running. Hall called the police from his neighbor's apartment at 11 p.m. to request that they investigate the horrific scene there. Law enforcement personnel arrived in a haste, their dazzling lights piercing the darkness of this wintry night. The Durham home's once orderly interior, which now appeared to have been devastated by a storm, was examined by investigators as they entered the building. When the Durhams were peacefully enjoying a late-night snack and their favorite TV show on the torn sofa set, the officers' attention was drawn to it. Pictures either hung at strange angles or lay shattered on the floor as if the offenders had been hunting frantically for something. Drawers had been ripped out, clothes had been thrown over the floor. They knew their investigation would be drawn out and challenging, so they arrived to the scene of the uproar and violence with a sickening feeling in the pit of their stomachs. A half-eaten baked chicken, which suggested that the crime took place while the Durhams were sharing a dinner together, was discovered on the kitchen table. The presence of unharmed goods sparked suspicions, even though at first it seemed to be just a straightforward heist gone wrong. 3 half-empty glasses and plates of barely consumed food were abandoned on a coffee table, and the television was still flickering. The fact that a money bag overflowing with cash was left intact indicates that the terrible crime was not committed just to accomplish a heist. The North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation agents carefully transported the victims to Chapel Hill for an autopsy. Knowing they had to act quickly, the results were dismal but not shocking. Dr. Paige Hudson, the state medical examiner, certified that the cause of death for the Durham family was strangling, even though the 2 men had been drowned and strangled as the Durham family murder investigation got underway. Agents from the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation broke into the Durham residence because they were committed to mercilessly and precisely uncovering the truth about the horrific killings. They thoroughly inspected the entire property as the investigation went on, methodically recording every tip and piece of information they discovered. The squad had grown to 7 or 8 agents by Saturday morning, but the investigation into the crime had just begun. 2 renowned physicists from the State Crime Laboratory joined the hunt late on Saturday night in Boone, and they contributed their expertise. As the investigation progressed, the mystery behind the Durham homicides became clearer because they thoroughly reviewed the evidence, put the jigsaw pieces together, and put in countless hours to figure it out. Important information carrying witnesses came forward. Nearly 10:30 p.m. An eyewitness reported seeing a green and white SUV depart the Durham residence that terrible night, but the vehicle vanished in an instant. The SUV was located on the side of the road after the North Carolina Highway Patrol searched for it a few miles distant. The motor was still running, and the windscreen remained intact. Doors were shut firmly, and snow was being smacked by the windscreen wipers. Later, it was learned that Bryce Durham had borrowed the SUV from his dealership to travel home in bad weather. The SUV was utilized by the murderers as an escape vehicle. During their examination of the vehicle, the police found a bag of silver that had probably been taken from the Durham residence. Investigators hoped that this crucial information would aid them in identifying the criminals responsible for this terrible crime. Investigating the Durham murders was a challenging procedure. Justin Troy Hall, the estranged son-in-law of Bryce and Virginia Durham, was one of the people being looked into by local law enforcement on the long, winding list of potential suspects. The Asheville men who were imprisoned and accused of the killings before being freed for lack of evidence were the subject of the investigation. The accuracy of the knots that were used to bind the victims sparked speculations and rumors of a contract killing, but as the years went by, leads ran out. Despite the persistent efforts of the Watauga County Sheriff's Department, the Boone Police Department, and the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation, the trail grew icier by the hour. It seemed as though the answers to this heinous act would always be a secret. The Durham triple homicide case remained unsolved for more than 45 years as detectives tried to piece the evidence together and leads dried up. However, in 2019, a glimmer of hope emerged as a result of a conversation between a man named Shane Burt and a sheriff's deputy in Georgia. Billy Sunday Burt, a suspected killer who was serving time for 3 murders he is thought to have committed in the 1970s, passed away in prison in 2017. Shane Burt, Billy Sunday Burt's son, was born to him. Research support was being given by Shane Burt when Burt revealed a shocking story of murder and mayhem that took place in the snowy mountains of North Carolina for an upcoming book by Phil Hudgens, a story of murder and mayhem in which, according to Burt, his father had admitted to killing 3 people during a severe snowstorm and had narrowly escaped. Capture the news sent shockwaves through the White County Sheriff's Office, which right away contacted their counterparts in Watauga County. The Durham murders case is currently being investigated once more, giving the relatives of the victims and those who died new hope that justice will be done. The wheels of justice never ceased turning. In the case of the Durham homicides, they did so gently but in the right direction. The sheriff's office held 3 distinct sessions over the course of 2 years, in September 2019, October 2020, and August 2021, each of which contained a critical piece of the puzzle for identifying the perpetrators of the horrible murders. Billy Wayne Davis, a known Billy Bird associate who was already serving a life term in Georgia for his prior offenses, was quickly located by investigators. The evidence from these interviews and 2 other sources was subsequently validated, revealing the truth. Through thorough evidence gathering and careful cross-referencing, the investigators were able to piece together an astonishing connection to a case from another state. The Fleming case, 1973, involved the Dixie Mafia, a loosely organized gang of criminals who had terrified the Southeast with their violent crimes 1960s and 1970s. The Durham homicides conditions were the same as this case's, and names began to circulate linking the 2 cases. Authorities claimed that Billy Wayne Davis, 81, a prisoner in Augusta, Georgia, is the only surviving member of the famed Dixie Mafia. He was a prison inmate there. He has served a life sentence for murder since 1986 and is currently detained at the Augusta State Medical Prison in Georgia. According to investigators, he disclosed details about a hired hit in the North Carolina mountains that failed after a heavy blizzards. Davis acknowledged being the group's getaway driver after the Durham family was killed, but he blamed the other 3 guys. Billy Sunday Burt, Bobby Jean Gaddis, and Charles David Reed, who entered the home that fatal night, declined to provide any new information on them despite the breakthrough in the Durham family murder case in 2022. Justice may never be fully served because the 4th suspect, 81-year-old Billy Wayne Davis, is currently serving a life sentence in a Georgia prison and is not anticipated to be freed anytime soon. Charges for the killings are not expected to be filed because 3 of the 4 suspects have already died. The idea of justice being served may be little more than a dream for the victims' families who have waited for answers for 5 long decades. This cold case's misery is only heightened by the mystery surrounding the people who ordered the hit, leaving the driving family members to wonder why their loved ones were targeted for death might always be with them. Chris Laws, Special Agent in charge of the Northwestern District for the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation, thanked both professionals and members of the community for their dedication throughout the years. The last surviving member of the Durham family, Ginny Durham, praised the hard-working individuals who had worked diligently for 50 years to crack the case involving her family. She applauded the detectives' efforts, saying they put in long days and weekends to solve the case. This news conference took place in 2022. Ginny Durham was extremely appreciative of Watauga County Sheriff Len Hagman, who never gave up trying to offer Ginny Durham's family some sort of resolution. She also thanked Wade Colvard, a special agent with the State Bureau of Investigation. Ginny Durham's connection with Carolyn Johnson, the captain of investigations for the Watauga County Sheriff's Office, and Charles Whitman, a retired SBI special agent who continued to work on the case even after retirement, meant the world to her and provided her hope during tough times. It demonstrates the resilience of the human spirit in the face of challenges that seem insurmountable. Sheriff of Watauga County Len Hagman also thanked all the departments, policemen, agents, and investigators who had spent years pursuing the case. The Watauga County Sheriff's Office praised the numerous individuals who contributed to solving the case and expressed gratitude for everyone's efforts in aiding the Durham family in obtaining answers. The resolution of the Durham case marked a turning point for the neighborhood that had been impacted by the tragic events of 1972. Rufus Edmonston, a former Attorney General of North Carolina, developed a particular interest in it. Watching Bryce Durham's mother die without receiving justice broke his heart. She had urged him to track down the offenders. I didn't want to let her down. For years and years, he insisted it was the mountain riddle, and Edmonston was frustrated that he couldn't figure it out on his own. But as a result of the diligent work of Sheriff Hajiman and his team, the case has now been resolved. It was a huge relief for him, and Edmonston expressed his gratitude to the investigators who made it possible. Despite the fact that Billy Sunday Burt was a serial killer who killed many people, Shane Burt, the criminal's son, wants to apologize to each and every one of his father's victims. Shane has no desire to conceal his heinous actions. Instead, he wants to provide as many people as he can with closure. It shows how dedicated and committed everyone involved was to seeing justice done that it took 50 years to solve the case. Despite the case's lack of resolution, its 50-year resolution offers some consolation and the hope that, even if justice has only been partially served, future generations will be able to rest easy.
It was a mystery in southwest Minnesota for 41 years. Who was the man murdered and dumped in a culvert near Beaver Creek? This week, authorities announced a surprising identification.
In March 1981, a worker for the Minnesota Department of Transportation in Beaver Creek Township found something shocking while cleaning out some concrete culverts near Interstate 90 and Highway 23. When skeleton bones were found, the cops were called right away. The area was blocked off and carefully looked into. The supervisor said that the culverts were cleaned out every year and that the last time this happened was in October of the year before. On March 13, 1981, A worker from the Department of Transportation was cleaning out the concrete culverts near Highway 23 and Beaver Creek Township near Interstate 90. As he cleaned up the mess, he was shocked to find the bones of a skeleton. When the cops showed up, the worker told his boss right away, and his boss called the police. When the cops showed up, the area was closed off, and everyone there was asked about what they had found. The boss said that the culverts were cleaned every year, and that the last time they were cleaned was on October 21, 1980. Investigators think the body was left in the culvert between October 1980 and January 1981. Forensic technicians and crime scene officers took the body away and tried to find any clues that might have been left behind. The body was taken to the Ramsey County Medical Examiner's office, but it was hard for the medical examiner to figure out who John Doe was, because the body had broken down so much that it was hard to tell from the nearly full skeleton. The coroner said that John Doe was a white man who was between 30 and 50 years old and stood between 5 feet 6 inches and 5 feet 8 inches tall. Given how the body looked, there was no way to find out the person's weight, hair color, or eye color. There were also no birthmarks or tattoos that could be used to identify the person. The doctor said that the victim might have been shot because there was a wound on the head that looked like it was made by a small caliber gun, but no gun or shell casings were found in the area. For his oral record, a plaster cast of his teeth was made, and DNA samples were taken from his bones. Fingerprints could not be taken because his fingers had broken up because of decay. The person had on green cotton work pants, a leather belt, and boxer shorts when they were found. He wore 2 pairs of green socks and slip-on engineer boots that were either light tan or white. He also had a comb made of black plastic and a charm with a picture of a baby inside. Using this vague description, police started a big search in the area and talked to Department of Transportation workers who had been there since October. A police artist used information from the medical examiner to make a rough sketch. Posters were then made and put up in and around Beaver Creek Township. They also asked drivers who use the road often and people who live in the area if they had seen anything strange. Checking records for missing people in and around Minnesota turned up nothing, and it seemed like no one knew who this person was. The case was finally closed because there were no more leads. No one had come forward to say that someone was missing in the area. Even police checked the file regularly. As technology improved, DNA profiles of known criminals were being digitized so that law enforcement could get to records more quickly and easily. In 1981, a profile of the Rock County John Doe was made and used to look for him on national criminal databases. But neither of these ideas worked because there was no record of the subject. For decades, nothing new was found out about the case. In August 2022, the Rock County Sheriff's Office and a nonprofit group called the Doe Network worked together to look into the case again. In the Rock County John Doe case, they used photos from the autopsy to make a digital composite sketch of John Doe. This sketch was then put on their website and other records of missing people. The next problem was getting enough money to pay for a DNA test. The sheriff's office was able to reach its goal and pay for all the tests needed to finish the task thanks to community events and fundraisers. The DNA samples given by the sheriff's office are used by volunteers from the Doe Network to start looking for family ties. After looking at thousands of family trees for months, they found a family mat near Omaha, Nebraska. The team then got in touch with the woman. She told them she didn't have any family who lived in Rock County or who had gone missing, but she was excited to meet with them after they got in touch. At the beginning of November 2022, people from the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension and the Rock County Sheriff's Office went to Omaha. Investigators met with members of the Gaetano family and the woman who fit John Doe's picture the most closely in Omaha. On December 20, 2022, members of the family agreed to have their DNA tested. Lewis would have been born in 1946. His family and old news stories say that Luis was a well-known bank robber in the 1960s. He was finally caught on January 25, 1966, when he was 20 years old and trying to rob a First National City bank in New York. Reports say that the bank teller was too strong for Luis, so she shot the desk instead. The story says that Lewis told detectives that he was desperate and sad, and that he wanted to end his life. Lewis was charged of trying to steal, assaulting a criminal, and having weapons. Since then, his family has heard from him now and then, but they haven't talked to him since 1971. He wasn't reported missing at the time because he didn't get along well with his family. They were just as surprised to find out he had been killed 10 years after he stopped talking to them. No one had ever come forward looking for Louise after he went missing. Since they know who John Doe is, investigators have already won half the fight. Even though it's not good news, Rock County Sheriff Evan Verbrugge called the situation bittersweet. Even though there is still a lot to learn about Mr. Gaetano's death, knowing who he was, even decades after he was killed, is a very important clue, he said. Brooks said that the case will stay open, even though it will be hard to find out what happened. Our job is to try to find out what happened, and the cost is small. He said anyone who may have known Louis Anthony Gaetano is being asked to come forward. The phone numbers for the Rock County Sheriff's Office will be in the box below our next case, which will take us to Rock County. Wisconsin has a lot of open spaces and parks where people can enjoy the outdoors and get back in touch with nature. But for 27 years, law enforcement officials were stumped by a puzzle until new DNA testing gave them the answers they needed. On November 11, 1995, a group of shooters in a wooded area near Bradford, Wisconsin, were looking for a group of deer. Gary Gilbank wanted to show his nephews how much he liked shooting, but he didn't know that he was about to show them a scene from a scary movie. As they got close to the southern bank of Turtle Creek, they saw the bones of a man on the ground. This confused them because they owned the land where the bones were, but no one knew who they belonged to or how they got here. As soon as the inspectors got there, they put up a fence around the area and started their probe. He looked like he was lying on his stomach with his hands over his head. His head and back were partly covered by a denim jacket, and he was wearing a t-shirt with the name of the British band Venom and a plaid shirt. He was also wearing gray camouflage pants, and one Nike sneaker was next to the body, but the other was not found. Investigators found a goat-horned pendant made of metal, a Budweiser lighter, an Aquatech watch, and a tube of Carmax lip balm at the crime scene. The body parts were taken away and taken to the coroner's office for further examination. The coroner began a thorough examination of John Doe. There were no signs of trauma on the body parts, and his height and weight were estimated to be between 5 feet 4 inches and 5 feet 6 inches and 140 pounds. Using a dental analysis, the coroner found that he was a Caucasian man between the ages of 17 and 20. He had only 2 fillings, which shows that he had good dental care. He still had all of his wisdom teeth, but 2 of them were only partly out and 1 was stuck. Samples of his hair were taken for a chemical test. There was no evidence of cocaine or morphine, so an overdose from a long-term opioid addiction is not likely. However, the doctor did not rule out the possibility that he was drunk or had used hallucinogens before he died. It wasn't clear what killed him, but he may have gotten too cold after falling into the creek. The coroner thought he might have been drunk and lost his way before deciding to lie down, and he might have died from being out in the cold. People had also talked about when he died, and the doctor thought it might have been in the fall or winter of 1994. Investigators had no leads besides the clues found on the John Doe at the scene. They started a full-blown study, which led them in many different directions. While this was going on, John Doe's head was burned, and the ashes, along with the rest of his body, were buried in the same cemetery as John and Jane Doe. Investigators looked into all known accidents that happened around the time John Doe died. They did this because they thought he might have been drunk and lost. They thought he might have been in a car accident and gotten lost afterward. But no reports were made of a lost person who matched his description. In fact, no missing persons report had been made for a man who looked like John Doe. Then the investigators went back and looked at all of the rock events that had been held in the area. People in the heavy metal scene were questioned because of the clothes John Doe was wearing when he was found, but no one could think of anyone who fit his description. They were once again stuck. Based on how old they thought he was, they looked through school yearbooks and government records, but they couldn't find any lost teens from that time. Interviews with students from the local school district turned up nothing, so detectives went back to the beginning. The agents then listened to what several people said about a man called River Guy in the area. Witnesses say that on October 16, 1994, around 5:30 p.m., a young guy in his early 20s was seen running toward the creek where the body was later found. Witnesses said that the River Guy was drunk and angry that afternoon, and that he was stumbling toward the creek and falling into the water several times as he tried to climb the slope. They also said that he had yelled at people to get away from him, and that he was on the run because a woman named Mary had done him wrong, and he was trying to get away from her. The idea was one of the best, until later forensic tests showed that River Guy and John Doe might not have been the same person because of changes in time. The rate at which John Doe's body broke down showed that he probably died around May 1995, not in October 1994, when River Guy last saw him. This also showed that the time of death given by the first medical officer was wrong. In 2010, a pendant found at the crime scene led Rock County Sheriff's officers to an area in Janesville. The man was a craftsman who was involved in the local metal rock scene. He had made several pieces for fans that were inspired by rock and metal. When cops showed him the pendant, he said it was one of his pieces. But he had made and sold many similar trinkets to many different people over the years. When a composite sketch of John Clinton Dell was shown to the craftsman, he didn't recognize him as a possible customer. This made the case harder in another way. By looking at bone tissue, forensic anthropology has used isotopic analysis to figure out where unidentified human bones came from. Scientists can use this information to find out where a person was born. For example, a Smithsonian scientist found that John Doe spent a lot of time in the Midwestern area around the Great Lakes, which includes the states of Wisconsin, Illinois, Minnesota, and Michigan. This information helped the police narrow down the area they were looking in. Once they knew where John Doe might have been born, they went back to the drawing board in 2016 and changed the composite sketches that the Rock County Sheriff's Department and the FBI had made in 2013 and 2014, respectively. This time, they made the picture look like the person was 16 years old and added color before making it public. Jack Fries, a private investigator, said the police were still working on the case. The whole point of this is to make people think about what they were doing in the early 1990s. And if they knew this guy, he said that their attempts had failed, but that agents would not give up so quickly over the next 2 years. Jack Fries, a private eye, kept trying to find out who the young John Doe was. In June 2018, Fries and Detective Corinne Billhorn reached out to the DNA Duel Project, a volunteer group that helps solve unsolved John and Jane Doe cases. Together with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, the team used the DNA that was taken and saved from the first autopsy to try to find out who John Doe was. In February 2019, the study team was able to find possible relatives of John Clinton Doe by using the ancestry website GED Match. They thought they knew who he was, but they wanted to make sure. They worked with the University of North Texas for the next 3 years to find John Doe's family. When they talked to the family, they found out that 2 of the volunteers were really John Doe. Carl was born on April 30, 1974, in Delavan, Wisconsin. When he was young, his parents broke up, and it looked like he never got over it. Carl went to an alternative high school for Badger, Delavan, Darien, and Elkhorn area high school kids in 1991. He was 17 years old at the time. Carl had become addicted to drugs. He had also joined a group of friends who planned a crime spree that led to damage to property and a lot of break-ins. In March 1992, he got 5 years in prison for breaking into and damaging golf carts at Delbrook Golf Course in Delavan. Between April 1992 and the fall of 1993, Carl was sent to 3 different jails. He ended up at the Oak Hill Correctional Institute in Oregon, Wisconsin. He had been let out of jail so he could go to a halfway house in Madison for a program to help him get off drugs. He was also able to see his mother, who was under house arrest, from time to time. Carl sometimes helped the police with drug cases by giving them information. In April 1995, he was on a home detention visit. On April 16, 1995, he just disappeared. No one saw or heard from him again. Carl was arrested right away by a county judge for breaking the terms of his probation, which was extended every year until April 2018. During the time Isaacs was gone, he was not found. Carl's parents had split up, and he was sort of living with his mom. During the press conference on June 14, 2022, where Carl Isaacs Jr.'s name was released, Jack Freeze thought that something made Carl break the rules of his probation and leave his house. Rock County Sheriff Troy Nunson was sad to have to talk about the untimely death of a young person in their community, but he was glad to be able to identify the person and bring a little bit of peace. He wouldn't say why the victim's family never reported him missing or give any information about them when asked. He did say, though, that the family had been getting ready for the news ever since the DNA matches and the probe. Nunson also said that the study took a long time, but that advances in technology made it possible to figure out who the person was. He thinks that Jack Freeze, a former worker at the Rock County Coroner's Office who helped with the case for free, was responsible. He also thinks that the DNA Doe project, which gave cops a break in the case, helped them find Carl Isaacs. Carl's body was found by Nick Gilbank, and that day is still clear in his mind. He said that he was glad John Doe's body had finally been found and that it made him feel better.
A breakthrough in the 1972 murder case of a 12-year-old Boardman boy.
In a press conference this afternoon, Boardman's police chief revealed they believe they know who's responsible for the murder.
Good Friday fell on March 31, 1972, and close friends Brad Bellino and Donald Don Templeton, both of whom were 12 years old at the time, were making preparations to spend the night at Don's home. They had spent the entire day, just like other guys their age, wandering around their suburban town of Boardman, Ohio, in the state of Ohio. They had been together for the previous 3 years, and during that time they had even played baseball together, with Brad serving as the catcher, Don as the pitcher, and Don's father as the team's coach. The plans that they had for that evening, however, were thwarted when Brad's father urged that he go back home. Because neither Brad's family nor the Templetons were able to provide him with transportation back to his house, Brad made the decision to walk the 3 miles that separated him from his home. It was still the age of innocence, so none of the boys gave it any attention. It was 7 o'clock when Brad left Don's residence. After that, no one ever saw him alive again. Friends and relatives of young Brad Bellino would be forced to wait for the next 50 years to learn the truth about who was responsible for his death. Bradley Bellino was the youngest of 5 children and the only boy in the family. He was born on April 7, 1959. His mother, Eliza, was a buyer for Lane Bryant, while his father, Joseph, worked shifts at Youngstown Shooting Tube, a local steel firm. He was born and raised in Mahoning County, Ohio, by his parents. Eliza worked for Lane Bryant, and Joseph worked for Youngstown Shooting Tube. When he was in the 3rd grade, he first met Don Templeton, and the two quickly became friends. Over the years, their relationship strengthened to the point that it is now unbreakable. By the time they were in the 6th grade, the two brothers had been friends for so long that they had spent practically every day together. Because of how late his parents got home from work, Brad and Don frequently rode the bus together after school and spent many evenings eating supper together. Because his parents were frequently running late, after that, he would either ride home with Don's parents or be picked up on his own. Both options were available to him. On March 31, 1972, the guys continued their routine as if nothing had changed. They hadn't had school over the Easter weekend because of the holiday, so they spent the whole day together. During the brief holiday, the boys had been taking turns spending the night at each other's homes, alternating between the two locations. Brad had remained over for supper, like he did on most nights, and had made the decision to call his parents and let them know that he would be sleeping at Don's place for the night. The phone was answered by Ricky, Brad's older brother, who stated that he would relay the message to Brad. However, 20 minutes later, Brad's father placed a phone call to the Templeton home and informed Brad that he needed to return home immediately. Around 7:30, Brad arrived at the conclusion that he would rather walk back than drive. Don's father was sick in bed while his mother was out shopping for groceries. Don was home alone. Joe, Brad's father, had just told his son that he was going to be gone for the night, but that he anticipated Brad coming home before he got back from work. Brad's mother was still working. The youngsters were under the impression that the journey was not that much because their little town was rather secure. After saying those words, Brad began the 3-mile trek, completely oblivious to the fact that this would be the last time he ever saw his best buddy or his family. The day after, which was a Saturday, found the Bellino household engaged in a number of activities. Nobody had picked up on the fact that Brad was absent from the house. Eliza hadn't seen her husband since she got home from work, so she had no idea that he had refused Brad permission to stay over at their house. Everyone proceeded about their day with the presumption that Brad was okay and most likely spending the night at his buddy Don's house, as is customary. After Brad did not come home as expected that afternoon, the Bellinos started to become concerned. They got in touch with Don's family, only to learn that Brad had already departed their home on Friday evening when they spoke to them. The alarm was instantly triggered, and the police were summoned to the scene. Authorities launched a comprehensive search effort in and around the town of Boardman, but the leads they uncovered were inconsistent. Even though Brad's family was well aware of his tendency to wander off, they became concerned when they didn't see him return home on Easter Sunday. The hunt for Brad proceeded over the course of the holiday weekend, but on Tuesday, April 4, 1972, the search took an unexpected and deadly turn. Around 8 in the morning, Paul Smith, an employee of the very sanitation company, was collecting trash from the dumpster located behind Isla's dairy store in the Boardman Plaza. It was during this time that he came across the body of a boy that was covered in cardboard boxes and waste from the surrounding businesses. He was quick to get in touch with the authorities, who arrived on the spot aware that they had located the missing child despite being only 12 years old. Tony D'Appolito, a Youngstown police officer and member of the Vice Squad, was contacted by detectives and asked to come down and identify the body so that they could get confirmation. D'Appolito was Brad's first cousin, and during the course of the weekend, he had been assisting in the hunt for the missing youngster. He was successful in establishing that it was in fact his cousin. It was discovered that Brad's striped pants were undone and dragged down below his hips when they were located. His head was discovered in a supine position, and his sneakers were found to be angled upward at an acute angle. It was discovered that Brad had secured his own belt around his neck in a very tight knot. After evidence was collected from the scene, Brad's body was transported to Southside Hospital in Youngstown, where it was examined by Dr. David A. Bielinke. A whole day and a full night after Brad was reported missing, a doctor made the diagnosis that he had been murdered at approximately 9 o'clock at night on Saturday. It was later revealed that the estimated time of death may have been incorrect because the contents of Brad's stomach still contained trace amounts of undigested chicken and pineapple. This was the final meal that Brad had eaten at Don's house before he passed away. The medical examiner came to the conclusion that he had been sexually molested as well as strangulated to death. The Tuesday in question was a sad day for everyone who was close to Brad, including friends and family. Tony D'Appolito was the one who had the unfortunate responsibility of breaking the news to his aunt and uncle. The catastrophe had ruined every aspect of their life. The news came as a complete surprise to Brad's schoolmates and pals. Don recalled hearing the news that Brad had been found while he was in a math lesson when their teacher made the announcement. When the students heard that their friend had been located, the entire class began to cheer. They were unaware that the instructor had not provided them with all of the details of the story. When she told them that his body had been discovered in a dumpster just 2 miles from his house, the tears of joy and relief quickly turned to tears of pain and sorrow. The inquiry was immediately opened by the police, and they started by questioning his closest friends and family members, including Don, who had been the last person to see him. Don told the detectives that they had been followed by a brown van on Friday. Don said this happened. It was not the first time that he had noticed the van tailing them either. When they realized that the same van had followed them on 3 or 4 consecutive occasions, it terrified both of the guys and left them feeling uneasy. Don had a strong conviction that the person who was operating the van was the one who had murdered Brad, since he had been following them and was waiting for an opportunity to ambush Brad in a shadowy area so that he could take him. Other interviews came from individuals who were adamant that they'd seen Brad on Saturday in and around the city. Because Friday was also a holiday, the investigators suspected that people were getting the days mixed up. The inquiry was carried on, but there were no new leads, which meant there was no progress made in the DNA analysis, and the case was starting to go cold as time went on. In June of 1972, the Templetons uprooted their lives and moved to the state of Tennessee. The burden of guilt had been too much for the family, especially for Don's mother, who blamed herself for not being available to bring Brad back to his residence when he needed her to do so. Although life would go on at some point, the tragedy that befell Brad Bellino would forever cast a shadow over the community of Boardman. A halting conclusion had been reached to the age of innocence. Investigators made the decision to exhume Brad's remains and collect DNA evidence in the year 2001, which was 29 years after he had been murdered. They hoped that with updated technology and improvements in DNA, the biological material that was taken from Brad's clothes and corpse might be utilized to establish a DNA profile, which may then possibly assist them discover the person responsible for Brad's death. They were successful in obtaining biological evidence from both Brad's body and the clothes he was wearing at the time of his murder from the garments. Using their expertise, forensic scientists were able to identify the DNA sample that did not belong to Brad. The foreign DNA that was recovered matched exactly with the DNA that was found on his clothing. The investigators entered the DNA profile into CODIS, but the database did not produce any result. They had a sample, but they had no leads despite the fact that they had it. In 2007, detectives Jack Nichols and Bob Rupp were assigned to Brad's investigation, along with the cases of 15-year-old Thomas Beard and 13-year-old David Evans, who had been killed between 1970 and 1975. All 3 of these children had been murdered between the years 1970 and 1975. Both Nichols and Rupp began working on Brad's case as a result of the fact that they had made the most headway with his inquiry over the course of the years. When I looked through the files for the case, I noticed that there were several names of people who had been persons of interest. At the time, it was common knowledge that the men in question were sexual predators who targeted young children. Nichols and Rupp were successful in obtaining search warrants for DNA samples, which allowed them to compare the samples to the profile that they had constructed. There was no one on the system that matched those criteria. By that point, Nichols had come to the conclusion that the murderer had either passed away soon after the crime or had not committed any other murders, since there was no DNA match on CODIS. The years went by once more as the investigators explored every avenue that was open to them. and repeatedly checked to see if any fresh DNA matches had been generated on CEODIS based on the sample of the suspect's DNA that they had provided. The inquiry proceeded without success until 2018, when it at long last produced a breakthrough. Due to the fact that the technology was able to trace DNA obtained at crime scenes through DNA that was donated by possible family members on genealogical websites, genetic genealogy testing was becoming increasingly popular in the context of criminal investigations. The same technology that had led to the arrest of the Golden State Killer in 2018 was used in this investigation as well. Because the technology was still relatively new, a great deal of testing was required before they could be certain that they had identified the offender. Since 2018, investigators have been working to locate the closest possible DNA match to that which was found on Brad's corpse and clothes by selecting names from a list of hundreds of people and narrowing it down from there. Through their collaboration with Parabon Nanolabs, the Boardman Police Department was able to narrow down the suspect's characteristics to include being of European descent, having fair skin with freckles, brown or hazel eyes, and either black or brown hair. After that, they had the laborious process of determining which of the possible suspects could have possibly been responsible for Brad's murder by researching their whereabouts around the time of the crime. This was a difficult and time-consuming task. On January 24, 2023, the Chief of Police in Boardman, Todd Worth, made the announcement that the department had located and identified Joseph Norman Hill as the individual who was responsible for the death of Brad Bellino on Easter weekend in 1972. However, Hill had already passed away in July 2019 from natural causes before this sentence was written. The investigators were able to establish that Hill's DNA was a 98% match to the DNA that was discovered on Brad's corpse and clothing. Hill's sample came from a family member who had contributed their DNA to a genealogy website. This relative's name has been withheld to protect their privacy. Because Hill's body was cremated after he passed away, it was impossible to obtain a sample that was 100% complete. One of the forensic scientists who worked for the Bureau of Criminal Investigation was certain that the sample was an accurate representation of the suspect. An investigation into Joseph Hill's past revealed that he was living in Boardman around the time when Brad was killed. He had been somewhere in the neighborhood of 32 years old at the time and had been residing on Shadyside Drive. He had previously worked as a truck driver for a company that produced bottled water. In 1978, he relocated his family from Boardman to California in order to pursue career opportunities there. The only time Hill was ever found guilty of a crime was in 1986 in Los Angeles, when he was charged with disorderly conduct and solicitation for a nasty act. He had a wife, however. She passed away in 1993 after a long marriage. He had a very small or non-existent family, and the information we have about him is, at best, scant. Before he passes away in 2019, he will eventually relocate to a facility that provides assisted living. Since the moment that Bob Rupp witnessed the removal of Brad Bellino's body from the dumpster, the case of the boy's murder has been a recurring nightmare for him. However, now that his murderer has been found, Bob Rupp is confident that the young man can rest in peace. According to Chief Worth, there has been no resolution to the investigation, and he is asking anyone who knew Joseph Hill around the time Brad was killed to come forward with any information they may have. They were investigating the instances of Thomas Beard and David Evans to determine whether or not there was a connection to Hill. Thanks